Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to the university for inviting me to come over and speak at this conference. And I'd like to also thank NewTek for sponsoring my trip to Mexico. This is my first visit to Mexico, and so far I've been here for 5 days, and I love it. It's absolutely fantastic. So obviously, coming from England, most of my research work has been done in Northern Europe. So the feeds that I have been working on and the situations that I have been studying have been in Northern Europe. But the problems of horses are the problems of horses. So I'm hoping that at least some of what I have to say to you this afternoon will be relevant to the horse industry in Mexico. And one of the things that still bothers me, and I think bothers all equine nutritionists worldwide, is the fact that it is a serious animal welfare issue, that diets associated with gastrointestinal disorders and abnormal stereotypic behavior are fed to horses today. So we have a lot of nutritional related problems with horses right across the world. And some of them that concern me most fit into 3 categories. First of all, there are the behavioral problems associated with feeding. So we've got stabled horses who are in a stressful condition, and they're feeling stressed because they're not fed in the right way. The management system is not conducive to good behavior. So they start doing aberrant behaviors, these behaviors that we don't want. Not only do we not want them because it drops the value of the horse, but also because it's an indicator that the animal is stressed. So things like crib biting, wind sucking, and box walking. The other category that I've been spending a bit of time studying are the metabolic problems. Now, these problems aren't always immediately seen. Acidosis, obesity can creep up on a horse, so you don't notice it's getting fatter. Colic is a major problem. I'm sure you have a lot of colics in Mexico as well. And colic is still the biggest cause of death of horses in the UK. And then we have other conditions such as azoturia, which is muscle cramp. But more recently, over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been particularly interested in the respiratory health. And so recently they have recategorized the respiratory problems that horses get, mainly to do with forage, dusty forage. So it's been recategorized into equine asthma, of which there are 2 categories. Severe equine asthma, which is the number 2 on that list, the recurrent airways obstruction. And the less severe case, but still pretty serious if you're a racehorse, is inflammatory airway disease. So how have our current feeding practices led to all of these conditions? Well, first of all, we nearly all feed too much cereals in meals. Horses were not designed to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They should be eating all the time. We also are inclined to feed limited forage. Now, forage is not just something for the horse to do in the stable. It should be a valuable nutrient source. It should be something that you regard as giving the animal some real nutrition. Sometimes, in racehorses, certainly in England, they will limit the feed and the water for hours before the animal races, in the worry that suddenly it might decide 20 minutes before it goes down to the start to drink 2 buckets of water. Why would it do that? It's our perception. It's not something that the animal would do. And then to put right all of these problems in our feeding systems, we decide to balance the diet by feeding a lot of supplements. I'm an equine nutritionist, and I go into the shop and I look at them and I think, whoa, which one do I choose here? There are so many on the market now, you don't know what is the right one. And many of them you don't need if you feed properly. So So looking at the first thing, looking at the meal feeding of high amounts of cereals, why am I concerned about that? Well, basically, the horse has not evolved to digest a lot of starch. If you compare the amount of amylase, the starch-digesting enzyme that the horse produces, it's significantly less than the pig and the rat. So these figures, the 2.3, 107 and 56, give you an idea of how little amylase the horse actually produces. Also, if we feed horses high amounts of starch, they become more difficult to handle or more reactive. And this was a study done by some of my colleagues at the university in Cirencester. And when they fed a high-starch diet, the horses were much more reactive in comparison to those that were fed the low-starch diet. Now, this makes them more difficult to control, but it's also stressful for them too. It's not just the fact that we don't want to get bucked off, it's the fact that it's stressful for the horse as well. And that's all to do with how the horse digests starch. If we look now at how these feeds actually respond in terms of the amount of glucose that they put into the bloodstream, these are just a range of feeds that shows you how quickly and how much glucose goes into the system after a meal. And if we just look at two of the main ones, the red line or the top line is oats. Now you can see how high that glucose peak is, but how short-lived it is too. So the animal gets low blood glucose, then it gets a feed, and the blood glucose shoots up, and then it decreases again. So it's a bit like you eating lots of chocolate. 1 minute you're hungry and you're feeling low in energy, and then suddenly you want to run a marathon, but 10 minutes later you're tired again. And this is exactly what it does to the horse as well. If we compare that to a high-quality fiber feed, the alfalfa, that purple line at the bottom is much smoother and less of a glucose peak. So the animal has got a constant supply of energy rather than making him no energy, lots of energy, no energy, lots of energy. It's a balance. The other problem that we have, we've seen some pictures this morning of rather underfed horses. Mostly in the UK, we get lots of overfed horses. But I'm sure there's a few overfed or fat and laminitic horses here in Mexico as well. And this was some data that was gathered by some of my students a few years ago now. And it shows the three categories of horses: leisure horses, showing horses, and national hunt animals. So we've got a bit of a spectrum there, a bit of a variety. And it shows how the digestible energy levels that they were fed. So the first column is the DE requirements in megajoules per day. That's based on the NRC 2007 values. And the second column is the amount of energy that all of these animals were being fed. And you can see that it is significantly more energy that they were being fed than actually they required. Not only were they fed more energy, but they also were fed more bulk. They were fed a greater amount than the recommended 2.5% of body weight in dry matter per day. And not surprisingly, that leads to this condition: obese animals. Now these are typical, what we would call laminitic phenotypes. So it's the body shape, it's the look of the animal that will tell you that these animals are predisposed to laminitis. And here is another one. I don't know how they got the saddle on that actually. But you can see on the rump area, you've got these pads of fat. You can see a lot of fat behind the rider's leg on the rib cage. But look at the neck, look at the cresty neck. That is a typical pre-laminitic horse. So this is a very serious sign of overfeeding. Once you do, or your animal gets laminitis, I'm afraid they are predisposed to laminitis for the rest of their days. And this in vitro starch degradation experiment explains a little bit of why that is the case. When fed a particular diet, the non-laminitic horses will digest so much of it, and the amount of gas that is produced, which tells you how much feed is being degraded, is a little bit lower and a little bit flatter. Feed the same diet to a laminitic, and they digest a lot more of it, and it's much a higher peak. So by your animal getting obese and being predisposed and having laminitis, you have changed the hindgut microbiome. So you have changed the bacteria and the fungi profile within the gut. And from then on, the animal will digest starch feed better than normal horses. But that's not better for them. It just is better for the microbes, but it's very bad for the horse. So you've really given yourself a problem for the rest of your days. With a laminitic horse, once they've had laminitis, you really should never put starch near them again, because this is what can happen. Now, in terms of the behavior, when I said at the beginning I was going to look at the behavior, this is the time budget of a horse out in the wild. Or even a horse out in an extensive field, just doing what it does, eating and wandering around. They should spend 60% of their time eating. Look what we do to them when we put them in a stable. We completely reverse that. So in fact, most animals, when you do a survey across all the stabled horses, you'll find that most of them are standing around doing nothing for 65% of the time instead of eating. So how do we get over this problem? Well, we need to look at actually what we are feeding. And the answer is in fiber, is in good quality fiber. Now, there's been lots of work done in Europe over the last 10 or 15 years looking at the incidence of colic and the digestive health of horses on fiber diets. And there's a definite lower incidence of colic and acidosis and all the problems that we're seeing if horses are fed an all-fiber diet. If they're fed an all-fiber diet, you can feed them so that they are eating for 16 hours of the day. So they are trickle feeding. And what I mean by trickle feeding is that they are eating all day so that there's a constant flow of digester through the gastrointestinal tract. And that's what must be done. That's what keeps the gut healthy. Part of trickle feeding is chewing. Chewing, horses will only produce saliva when they chew. Saliva buffers the acids in the stomach, so it helps to keep the stomach healthy. Constant flow of feed keeps the digester moving through so that all the gas can be passed out the back end because horses don't belch. And it's better for the teeth. But one of my missions over the last number of years, I did my PhD in fiber nutrition, so I've been banging this particular drum for a long time. But fiber must be regarded as a valuable nutrient source. This is something that the horses can actually gain nutrients from. The trouble with feeding fiber all the time is that if you have got horses that do well on fiber, then they can become obese. Also, if you've got constant access to lots of hay and fiber, then the animal has continually got his nose in the middle of the hay and he's breathing in lots of dust. So let's look at the first problem. Let's look at the obesity in horses. How have we tried to get over this constant access? So we want our animals to be eating for 16 hours a day, but we don't want them to blow up like balloons. So there's a whole series of ways in which you can slow down the consumption of fiber in the stable. The first one is using very small-holed hay nets. The trouble with hay nets is that the animal is eating at an unnatural angle. But the second problem with hay nets is when they pull the hay out of the bag swings around, there's clouds of dust around the animal. So all the time he's creating a lot of dust around him, which he's breathing in. And we'll come back to that in a minute. There are now quite a range of these slow feeders that are being developed in Europe and particularly in the UK. In fact, there are quite a lot of them in America now as well. On the top corner there is just a homemade version, and people do make their own. And it's simply a box or a container with a grid. And this box sits on the floor so that the animal eats at a natural angle. But it can't eat large mouthfuls at a time. It has to work to get its food. And that's the most important thing. So it extends the eating time. There are a number of proprietary ones on the market as well. And there's lots of advantages and disadvantages to all of them. But to put some figures and some measurements behind this, one of my master's students last year studied the hay-gain forager, which is the bottom right-hand slow feeder there. And this is the results of, in a nutshell, this is the results of her experiment. So she compared loose hay, so just hay on the ground. Then she put hay in a hay net, like the purple one that we saw earlier. And then SLE and SFS, can't even say that, are two levels of grid on the slow feeder. So SLE is the slow feeder easy grid. So that grid has got bigger holes in it and allows the animal to eat a little bit more fiber at a time in a mouthful. The normal grid, or the standard grid, has got much smaller holes in it, and they really have to work at it. They have to nibble at it, and they can get small amounts out at a time. So if we look at the first line there on the results of the intake time, just to home in, the SED at the end of the column is just giving us the significant differences, the statistics. And the little letters, the A's, B's, and C's, just show which system is significantly different from the other. And we can see, just to not spend too much time on this, but just looking at the slow feeder standard grid, so the one with very small holes, it doubled, or more than doubled, the intake time. So that was a very good result, because it meant that you could give an animal so many kilos of hay and it would take twice as long to eat it. So for the fat horse in the stable, that was a very good result. And the consumption rate, the rate as you can see, mirrors that. But one of the concerns that people in the UK had about these slow feeders was, well, would horses show frustration behaviour? Would they start to kick 7 bells out of the feeder because they knew the hay was there and they couldn't get at it? And were we going to interfere with their well-being in another way? People in the UK are great skeptics. They don't take to a new idea very, very well. I'm sure all of you are much more open to new ideas. But what we did in this is we looked at 2 measurements of stress in horses. And these have been developed by my colleague Andrew Hemmings in Cirencester. We're looking at blink rate. Now, blink rate is the number of times in a given period that a horse blinks. And that is indicative of the amount of dopamine that the animal is producing. So when an animal is very stressed, it wants to produce more dopamine, so it's an opioid and it makes it feel calmer. And that's what they do when they crib bite and when they weave. So if you get high levels of blinking, it will show lots of stress. And the very bottom line, which is a little bit close to the bottom of the screen, but BIR is behavioural initiation rate. Now that's another indicator of stress that we have developed. And it tells you how busy the horses are in the stable. So if they drink, and then they eat, and then they stand, and then they walk around the box, and then they eat, and then they drink, and they're very busy all the time, again, they're stressed. They're not relaxed. They're not just standing eating like they didn't have a care in the world. So again, we're looking for low levels of behavioral initiation rate to show that these animals are not stressed. And in both cases, as you can see from the figures, there was no significant difference in any of the treatments between blink rates or behavioral initiation rates. Now, they were very variable, as some of the values there will indicate, because some horses are more stressy normally than others are calmer. But there was no difference, and that meant that the slow feeder did not produce any bad effects in the horse in terms of stress. So it significantly increased eating time by 50%. There was no frustration. Took them time. They stood at the back of the stable and looked at the slow feeder for a while before they would go and eat from it. But as soon as they learnt to eat from it, they got on with it fine. They're eating at a more natural angle because they're pulling the hay up like they should be, like they would be grazing. And it also, we found, reduced dust in the breathing zone because the hay is contained within a container and they're not shaking the whole bag of hay every time they take a mouthful. So it was a good result for the slow feeder. Having mentioned dust now, this is what I've been spending a lot of my time over the last few years looking at and trying to find ways in which we can reduce the dust that the animal is exposed to. We know that normal horses and ponies, that neutrophils are increased, so that one of the main indicators of respiratory stress are increased tremendously when the horses are in a stable. And if you put them onto a low dust regime, such as shavings and pelleted hay, you can reduce the respiratory response by 97%. You can reduce the dust levels in the breathing zone. But I've just told you that we want horses to be eating for 16 hours in the day. They should be chewing to trickle feed, and they should be eating long forage because that is natural. So actually, it's not that easy to maintain a horse on pelleted feed because they can't eat for long enough. So we have to find another way of actually dealing with this dust. But before I talk generally about dust, I just want to mention a little bit about the particular dust that we are interested in. Previously, everybody's thought pollens were not a problem. I'm going to tell you in a minute why I think they are. Beta-glucans have been indicated to be a problem in respiratory disorders, as indeed of dust mites, mold spores, bacteria spores. And lipopolysaccharides, which are the gram-negative coat on bacteria, so it's the cell wall of bacteria, they will upregulate the response to all of these allergens. So if you have lipopolysaccharides, a horse will react even more to mold spores and bacteria spores. But recently, my PhD student, who's much cleverer than I am, and he's been doing some very good work, and he has come up with some very good results on actually taking serum and bowel fluid, bronchoalveolar lavage fluid, from horses that have got respiratory disorders. And he has found that these animals have produced antibodies, IgE antibodies, to these main bacteria, excuse me, a range of fungi, quite a few arthropods, so we have cockroaches, mites, and midges, but most interestingly, pollens. So he has found that some horses are producing allergy to certain grass pollens and tree pollens. Now, we have always thought that pollens were too big to be respired or breathed down deep into the lungs. But Sam's work has shown that this is not the case and that animals are allergic to pollens, or can be. So how do we deal with this dust? What do we do? Well, we can obviously improve ventilation in the stable. That's very important. And we can make sure we have them bedded on low dust bedding. Now, that's actually reasonably easy to do. You can buy low dust dust bedding, dust extracted shavings, etc. But it's more difficult to change the management techniques and to actually do something about the forage, because as we've just said, forage is quite dusty. So we should be looking at high quality forage. Now, we're completely the opposite in the UK to you are here, in that we've got so much rain, it's not true. And so it's difficult sometimes to make good hay. So to conserve what we call young leafy forage, and we just saw earlier on today about how the digestibility of the grass decreases as it gets more mature. So we want to have nice young leafy forage. Sometimes that's very difficult to make. So we make haylage. Now haylage isn't silage and it's not hay. It's somewhere in between. So it's about 50% dry matter. And most of the time it is fermented so that you've got lactic acid fermentation, but it's not as acidic as silage. But sometimes if it's a bit drier, it's just preserved because it's wrapped. So it's wrapped in plastic and the air is excluded. But haylage isn't necessarily the answer, because if you look at the amount of airborne respirable dust that you can get from haylage, it can be considerable as well. So you've really got to look at the quality. Even good quality hay can be dusty. So you've got to look at the quality of your forage and find it the best you can, and then get rid of the dust. So we looked at dust, and we've spent far too many hours of my life now counting respirable particles in the lab. And we used this cyclone sampler, which separates the respirable dust, so that dust that the animal breathes deep into the lungs and will set up the respiratory disorders, and the rest of the dust, which is around but is not an allergy problem because it's not breathed deep into the lungs. So this particular little machine separates the respirable dust from the rest and allows us to count the particles. That's why you have students, because they spend their time counting particles. So not only do we do this in the laboratory, but we also can do this with the horse. So we put the cyclone sampler onto a head collar, and the pump which sucks the air through and samples the air is on a roller. And this means that we can measure the amount of dust that the horse is exposed to where he puts his nose, where it's important, where he's breathing in. So we decided to look at what is the best regime. How do we improve this stable environment? So we looked at 4 different regimes. We looked at each of those regimes in 2 types of stables. Now, American barns are getting more common in the UK, but we've still got lots of very old-fashioned single stables that are organised in yards and rows. And so the animal has its own airspace rather than sharing it with others. We did 8 replica bottles, so we did 64 measurements. And we did the ARD as the airborne respirable dust in the breathing zone. And then we did the airborne respirable dust in the stable zone. And here are the results. Now these are the 4 regimes. So we had shavings and steamed hay, which was the lowest dust regime that we could have. Then we had shavings and dry hay, so we had a low dust bedding, but a dustier forage. Then we had straw and haylage, so a dusty bedding, but a low dust forage, or lower dust forage. And then we had straw and dry hay, which was the dustiest regime. And not surprising, we could have predicted this, but it was good to measure it, was across both the types of stable types, that the shavings and steamed hay had significantly lower airborne respirable dust per litre of air in comparison to the shavings and dry hay, then the straw and haylage, and last of all the straw and dry hay. So it didn't take Einstein to work that one out. But what was interesting are these results. When we look at the difference in the amount of dust in the stable zone and the breathing zone, the type of regime followed as you would expect. So in the first one, when we had low dust regime, we had low dust in the stable zone and the breathing zone across both types of management of stable types. When we had dry hay and shavings, not surprisingly, the dust increased in the breathing zone, and again in both types. And vice versa, when we had haylage and straw, the dust increased in the general stable zone. But the bottom line concerned me most of all. The dry hay and straw was dusty in both places. So it was dusty for them to breathe in, and it was dusty in the general stable zone. But if you look at the figures there and comparing the American barn system with the individual stables, you can see how much dustier it was in the American barn system. Now that told me two things. One, horses are very generous. They share their dust with each other. So within this breathing zone and stable zone, they're passing dust from one to another. So very dusty. But it also shows that if you've got a horse with a respiratory problem and you put this horse in that stable on a low dust regime, but the rest of the barn is not on a low dust regime, you're not doing a lot of good because they're passing their dust around. They're sharing their dust. And so your horse you're paying for more for shavings and you're keeping the dust down, and everybody else is giving you their dust. So it's a lesson to learn. So obviously it's important now to take the dust down, and with these figures we'll show you the impact it has on the horse in the stable. So if we look at what sort of things do we do to reduce the dust within the in the forage? So we can look at soaking and steaming. So this is highly technical. So this is where we just put hay in a bag and put it in a bucket of water and weigh it down and soak it. Okay, that's a very popular practice in the UK. Or, again, they're very good at doing DIY in the UK. They like to make their own things. You can steam it in two different ways. You can buy a big bin, and you just get a little steam generator, a little wallpaper stripper. You put your hay in there and you steam it. Or you can put the hay in a bag and pour a kettle of hot water over it. Okay. The other way you can steam your hay, of course, is to use a proprietary steamer. Now, this steamer was specifically designed to actually steam hay properly. And you can see in the bottom right-hand picture there, you have got spikes. And the spikes, when you put the hay bale into the steamer, push the hay bale down onto the spikes, turn the steamer on, and it forces the steam up into the bale. So all of the bale gets very steamed, very high temperatures. Okay? So those are the different ways we have at the moment. Nobody's yet developed a large microwave to do hay in. So we're either soaking or steaming. So how well do they work? Well, the airborne respirable dust levels will be reduced by 10 minutes soaking of your hay. So it does work. The trouble with soaking is that it leaches valuable nutrients from the forage. And what have I just said at the beginning? Forage is a valuable source of nutrients. So why would you want to wash these nutrients out of the hay? But the other thing that worries me is that the post-soak effluent is a biological hazard. It's a pollutant. It's like sewage. So you shouldn't be putting it down drains. But particularly worrying is that it increases the bacteria 2 to 5-fold on the hay. I'll tell you a little bit more about that bacteria tomorrow if you can bear another talk from me. But there's quite an increase, and there's something that just doesn't feel right about that. So looking at these bacteria, the amount, just without looking at the types yet, 1.5 hours we had an increase in the profile of bacteria, the greater abundance. At 9 hours we had an increase in pathogens. And at 16 hours, we had an increase in gram negatives and lipopolysaccharides. And I've just said that lipopolysaccharides will actually increase your horse's response to allergens so that it increases the likelihood of respiratory disorder. So soaking is not something that I recommend you do. So in summary, soaking leaches nutrients. It increases bacteria. It produces nasty post-soak liquor. And you can actually soak to get rid of water-soluble carbohydrates, but you need to steam afterwards. Otherwise, you've got a problem with the bacteria. So that's not something to do either. If you do use a homemade steamer, what you're getting there is you're acting as an incubator. You're just actually causing the hay to heat up, and just the bacteria grows. So that is not a recommended process either. So just looking at how these affect the airborne respirable dust, all of these different treatments, the soaking and the steaming are equally effective at getting rid of airborne respirable dust. The bin less so, and the kettle less so. So not only do the bin and the kettle increase bacteria, but they also are less effective at getting rid of airborne respirable dust. And the same with the mold, and the mold is reduced slightly with the bin, but not as much as with the proper hay steamer. So with the high temperature HG 600 hay steamer, you can reduce that respirable dust and mold, and you also reduce the bacteria. But with the bin, you increase the bacteria by 200%. So in conclusion, how do I think you should be feeding your horse? You should feed a high-fiber diet. You should be feeding a minimum of 15 grams per dry matter per kilogram body weight per day. If you do that, you're going to get a better hindgut microbiome. The profile within the hindgut is going to be better and healthier. Feeding that amount of fiber will ensure you've got trickle feeding, and trickle feeding promotes natural time budgets, digestive flow, it's good for the teeth, and the glycemic response is kept constant. You don't have this glucose peak going up and down. To ensure the hygienic quality, try and get as good quality a forage as you possibly can. Make it well and store it well. And be very aware of the dust within the stable. Reduce the airborne respirable dust by high temperature steaming, which is by far the best way of doing it. It's very palatable, there's no loss of nutritional value, and you reduce the bacteria and fungi content. So I'd like to acknowledge all the students who've done a lot of hard work on counting bacteria and looking at mold levels, etc., and to Haygain Limited for sponsoring some of the work on the steaming. And thank you for your attention.